July 26, 1944. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The tropical sun hung directly overhead, baking the steel-grey surfaces of the Pacific Fleet until the air itself seemed to shimmer and distort above the water. The harbor, usually a cacophony of refitting hammers, shouting bosun's mates, and the roar of radial engines testing on the Ford Island airstrip, had fallen into a tense, regulated silence. Security patrols cut through the oily water in smaller craft, their wake slapping against the hulls of massive warships that had been resurrected from the mud of 1941. At the center of this vast metallic armada lay the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore, a floating fortress of the Oregon City class, her fresh paint gleaming, her guns trained and locked, serving not as a weapon of war on this specific afternoon, but as the temporary throne room for the most powerful man on Earth. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, sat on the quarterdeck in his wheelchair. The chair itself was a common sight to his inner circle, but a closely guarded state secret to the wider world. A mechanical concession to the polio that had withered his legs 2 decades prior. He wore a light seersucker suit and a Panama hat to deflect the punishing Hawaiian glare, the brim pulled low over eyes that were deeply shadowed by 12 years of economic depression and 3 years of global war. He was a dying man. His arteries were hardening, his heart was enlarging, and the weight of the free world had etched deep canyons into his greying face. Yet, as he puffed on his cigarette holder, the angle of his jaw remained defiant. He was waiting. And in the hierarchy of power, the one who waits is usually the one in command, unless the one being waited for is making a calculated statement of rebellion. He was waiting for General Douglas MacArthur. The meeting had been scheduled for hours ago. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, had arrived precisely on time, his dress whites immaculate, his demeanor cool and professional, the very embodiment of naval discipline. But MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Southwest Pacific area, was nowhere to be seen. The delay stretched on. The sun beat down. The president's aides checked their watches, exchanging nervous glances, wiping sweat from their brows with damp handkerchiefs. This was not a logistical error. In the intricate, ego-driven theater of high command, lateness was a weapon. It was a non-verbal declaration of independence, a signal that the general did not consider himself a subordinate summoned by a master, but a sovereign power arriving at his own pleasure. Finally, a siren wailed in the distance. A motorcade approached the dock, but the drama was only beginning. A launch was dispatched to bring the general to the cruiser. As the boat cut across the harbor water, observers on the deck of the Baltimore raised their binoculars. They expected to see a general in his formal dress uniform, the attire required by military protocol when meeting the commander-in-chief. Instead, as the figure came into focus, a ripple of shock went through the assembled naval officers. MacArthur stood in the prow of the launch like a conquering Caesar, wearing his signature crushed operational cap, soaked with the sweat of the tropics, seeking to cultivate the image of a warrior fresh from the front lines. He wore no tie, his sunglasses were perched on his nose, and most egregiously, he wore a battered leather flight jacket, open at the collar, a garment that screamed of the cockpit and the trench, not the diplomatic conference. When the launch reached the Baltimore, the breach of protocol escalated from wardrobe to choreography. By strict naval tradition and Secret Service requirement, the general's vehicle, once he transferred to the dock and then to the car on the pier, was supposed to follow the president's limousine in a respectful procession. But as the vehicles began to move toward the secondary inspection point, MacArthur ordered his driver to accelerate. The general's car surged forward, pulling alongside the president's vehicle, the engines whining in protest. For a long, uncomfortable minute, the two cars drove abreast, wheel to wheel. A mechanical duel played out on the tarmac. It was a visual metaphor, so blunt it required no interpretation. MacArthur was not following Roosevelt. He was running parallel to him. Upon reaching the gangway, MacArthur ascended to the deck of the Baltimore. The Marine Guard snapped to attention. Admiral Nimitz saluted sharply. President Roosevelt, seated in his wheelchair, looked up, his expression unreadable behind his own spectacles. The gathered brass held their breath. The Army Field Manual and centuries of military tradition demanded that a uniformed officer salute his commander-in-chief. MacArthur stopped. He looked down at the president, He did not raise his hand to his brow. Instead, he extended it forward, seizing Roosevelt's hand in a firm, equal shake. "Mr. President," he boomed, his voice theatrical and resonant, "you look grand." It was a lie, and they both knew it. It was also a public humiliation of the highest order, a calculated refusal to submit to the authority of the office, masked as a gesture of camaraderie. In that singular moment, the deck of the Baltimore became a battlefield more personal and venomous than any beachhead in the Pacific. To understand the density of hatred in that handshake, one must peel back the layers of history that lay calcified between these two titans. This was not merely a disagreement over strategy, it was the culmination of a decade-long feud that touched on the very nature of American democracy. Their animosity dated back to the Great Depression, specifically the summer of 1932, and the tragedy of the Bonus Army. Thousands of desperate World War I veterans had camped in Washington, D.C., demanding the early payment of service bonuses to feed their starving families. President Herbert Hoover, paralyzed by the crisis, had ordered the Army to clear the camps. The man who executed that order was Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur. Ignoring instructions to show restraint, MacArthur had used tanks, tear gas, and cavalry with drawn sabers to rout the veterans, burning their shanties to the ground while the Capitol dome loomed in the background smoke. Franklin Roosevelt, then the governor of New York and running for president, had watched the debacle with political horror and personal disgust. He is reported to have remarked to an aide that MacArthur was one of the two most dangerous men in America, the other being the populist demagogue Huey Long. To Roosevelt, MacArthur represented the spectre of Caesarism. The man on the white horse who might use military adoration to subvert the Constitution during a time of national collapse. When Roosevelt won the presidency, he kept MacArthur close, not out of affection, but out of the Machiavellian instinct that it is better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in. He extended MacArthur's term as Chief of Staff, a move designed to prevent the general from retiring and running for office against him. The tension simmered for years, boiling over occasionally in private meetings where MacArthur's arrogance clashed with Roosevelt's aristocratic condescension. But the dynamic shifted cataclysmically on December 7, 1941. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, they also struck the Philippines, where MacArthur was in command of American and Filipino forces. Despite having 9 hours of warning after the Hawaii attack, MacArthur's Air Force was caught on the ground at Clark Field, lined up wingtip to wingtip, and destroyed by Japanese bombers. It was a tactical blunder of epic proportions, arguably worse than the surprise at Pearl Harbor because it was inexcusable. Yet, MacArthur was not relieved of command. He became the face of American resistance as his forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. The subsequent escape of MacArthur from Corregidor in March 1942 is a story often told as a heroic odyssey, but in the White House it was viewed with deep ambivalence. The president had ordered MacArthur to leave, not to save the man, but to save the symbol. Roosevelt knew that a captured American general would be a propaganda victory for Tokyo. MacArthur left his starving troops behind men who would soon face the horrors of the Bataan Death March and slipped away on a PT boat. The PT, or Patrol Torpedo Boat, was a plywood-hulled 80-foot craft powered by 3 Packard 12-cylinder engines. It was fast, noisy, and incredibly uncomfortable in rough seas. For a man of MacArthur's age and status, the harrowing journey through Japanese patrolled waters was physically punishing, a fact he would later use to burnish his warrior credentials. Upon arriving in Australia, he issued the most famous proclamation of the war. "I shall return." That 3-word sentence, "I shall return," became a millstone around the neck of American strategy. It was a personal pledge from a general to the people of the Philippines, but it had not been cleared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the President. It committed the United States to a specific strategic path based on a general's honor rather than military necessity. By 1944, that pledge was coming due, and it stood in direct conflict with the cold logic of the United States Navy. This brings us to the core conflict of the Honolulu Conference on the Baltimore, the choice between two paths to Tokyo. The Pacific Theater was unique in the history of warfare because of its sheer, mind-bending geography. The theater covered 64 million square miles, an area larger than all the landmass of Earth combined. Fighting a war across this expanse required a mastery of logistics and engineering that was unprecedented. The tyranny of distance meant that for every bullet, gallon of aviation fuel, or tin of spam used at the front, tons of supplies had to be moved thousands of miles across submarine-infested waters. By the summer of 1944, the American war machine had evolved into a two-headed monster. One head was Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive. This was a Navy-centric campaign that thrust directly across the ocean, hopping from island group to island group, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. It was a direct, brutal, and highly efficient route. The Navy's strategy relied on the fast carrier task forces, floating cities of steel that could project air power anywhere, independent of land bases. The second head was MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Drive. This was an army-centric campaign that crawled up the northern coast of New Guinea. MacArthur's strategy was based on the umbrella theory. He argued that amphibious landings should only take place within the range of land-based fighter cover. His forces would seize an airfield, move fighters forward, and then use that air cover to protect the next jump. It was a slower, more methodical approach that minimized naval risk but required massive amounts of manpower and engineering to hack airfields out of the jungle. Now, the two drives were converging. The question was, where to go next? The Navy, represented by Admiral Ernest King in Washington and Nimitz in Hawaii, advocated for bypassing the Philippines entirely. Their logic was ruthlessly mathematical. The ultimate goal was the defeat of Japan. To do that, they needed to sever the shipping lanes that brought oil and rubber from the East Indies to the Japanese home islands. They also needed air bases close enough to Japan to allow the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to conduct sustained strategic bombing. The B-29 was a technological marvel that dictated strategy. It was the most expensive weapons project of the war, exceeding even the Manhattan Project in cost. With a wingspan of 141 feet and pressurized cabins that allowed it to fly at 30,000 feet, above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters, it was a weapon of mass destruction designed to burn Japanese cities to the ground. But it needed bases. The Navy argued that the island of Formosa, known today as Taiwan, was the ideal target. Taking Formosa would cut the Japanese supply lines and provide air bases closer to Tokyo than the Philippines. Furthermore, Formosa had harbors that could support the deep draft vessels of the fleet. MacArthur's counter-proposal was to invade the Philippines, specifically the island of Luzon. He argued that bypassing the Philippines would be a moral catastrophe. He believed that leaving 17 million Christian Filipinos and thousands of American prisoners of war to suffer under Japanese occupation would destroy American prestige in Asia for a century. But beyond the moral argument, MacArthur had his own technical reasons. He argued that an invasion of Formosa would be a logistical nightmare without first securing the flank. He claimed the Navy was underestimating the strength of the Japanese garrison on Formosa and overestimating their own ability to support a landing there without land-based air support from the Philippines. The technical crux of the debate often came down to a single unglamorous vessel, the LST, or landing ship, tank. These flat-bottomed, 328-foot ships were the workhorses of amphibious warfare. They were designed to beach themselves, open massive bow doors, and disgorge tanks, trucks, and troops directly onto the sand. They were ugly. Slow crews joked that LST stood for large, slow target, and absolutely vital. There were never enough of them. The invasion of Europe at Normandy in June 1944 had consumed a vast armada of LSTs. The Pacific theater was starving for them. A simultaneous invasion of the Philippines and Formosa was impossible. There simply wasn't enough hull displacement to carry the men and machines. A choice had to be made. This was the dossier of facts and friction that sat on the table in the plotting room of the Waikiki mansion, where the conference moved after the initial reception on the Baltimore. The mansion, a sprawling white structure overlooking the surf, was chosen for privacy. The windows were blacked out, the maps were pinned up, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the humidity of the Hawaiian night. Roosevelt, acting as the supreme arbiter, presided over the sessions. He looked frail, his hands shaking slightly as he lit his cigarettes, but his mind was razor-sharp. He knew that the decision he made here would likely determine the outcome of the 1944 presidential election. A protracted, bloody stalemate in the Pacific could cost him the White House. He needed a victory, and he needed the support of the American public, who idolized MacArthur. The sessions during the day were formal, with pointers tapping against the vast charts of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Nimitz presented the Navy's case with cool, detached precision. He used a pointer to trace the supply lines, the radii of aircraft ranges, the distances between fueling depots. He spoke of tonnage, of knots, of fuel consumption rates. He argued that the Philippines could be neutralized by air power and bypassed, leaving the Japanese garrison there to wither on the vine, cut off from supply, just as they had done at Rabaul. It was a sound military strategy, endorsed by the Joint Chiefs. Then it was MacArthur's turn. He did not use a pointer initially. He used his voice. He began to pace the room, his leather flight jacket creaking softly. He painted a picture not of logistics, but of betrayal. He spoke of the moral obligation to the Filipino people. He looked directly at Roosevelt and reminded him of the promise made. "I shall return." If the United States broke that promise, he argued, they would be viewed as imperialists, no better than the Japanese or the old European colonial powers. But MacArthur knew that moral arguments alone would not sway a room of pragmatists. He pivoted to the technical and tactical realities. He attacked the Formosa plan. He pointed out that the invasion of Formosa would require an amphibious assault against a hostile shore defended by heavy fortifications, without the benefit of land-based air support. The fleet would be tethered to the island during the unloading phase, sitting ducks for Japanese land-based air power flying from China and the Philippines. He invoked the spectre of Gallipoli, the disastrous amphibious campaign of World War I. He argued that taking Luzon in the Philippines was the safer, more technically sound option. The Philippines had a friendly guerrilla network that was already providing intelligence. It had ample space for airfields. It had internal harbors. The climax of the conference occurred not in the formal sessions, but in a private meeting between Roosevelt and MacArthur. Accounts of this meeting vary, but the essence is consistent. The two men were alone, or nearly so. MacArthur, sensing that the decision was tipping toward the Navy, unleashed the full force of his personality. He reportedly stood over the president, a physical dominance that Roosevelt usually forbade, and delivered an ultimatum disguised as a prediction. He told the president that if he bypassed the Philippines, "I dare not attempt to forecast the reaction of the American people. It was a veiled political threat. Deny me, and I will destroy you in the court of public opinion." Roosevelt, exhausted, his face grey with fatigue, looked at the general. He saw the arrogance, the insubordination, the theatricality. But he also saw the political reality. MacArthur was a hero to the voters. The Philippines was an American possession, technically U.S. soil. To bypass it would be seen as abandoning American territory. The technical arguments for Formosa were sound, but the political and psychological arguments for the Philippines were overwhelming. There is a specific moment described by witnesses where MacArthur picked up a pointer and gestured violently at the map, effectively lecturing the president. "Mr. President," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we cannot deny those people their liberation." He spoke of the prisoners of war, men he had commanded, starving in camps like Cabanatuan. He made the president feel the weight of every skeleton in those cages. Roosevelt finally broke the silence. He asked, "Douglas, to take Luzon, you would have to bypass Mindanao." MacArthur immediately launched into a tactical explanation of how he would seize Leyte first, establishing a base, and then jump to Luzon. The conversation shifted from if to how. The tension in the room broke. Roosevelt had conceded. The Navy's plan for Formosa was effectively dead. The Hawaii power play had worked. MacArthur had arrived late, insulted the president, violated uniform regulations, and yet, through sheer force of will and political leverage, he had hijacked the strategy of the Pacific War. The consequences of this decision were immediate and far-reaching, rippling out from that room in Waikiki to the shipyards of America and the jungles of Asia. The logistical machinery of the United States military had to pivot. The invasion of Formosa, codenamed Operation Causeway, was shelved. The invasion of Leyte, leading to the liberation of the Philippines, became the primary objective. This shift required a massive reorganization of naval forces. Admiral Nimitz, despite his preference for the Formosa plan, pledged his full support. This is a testament to Nimitz's character and professional discipline, contrasting sharply with MacArthur's ego. Nimitz agreed to lend the Third Fleet, under the command of the aggressive Admiral William Bull Halsey, to support MacArthur's landings. This collaboration would lead to the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. The technical complexity of the Leyte operation was staggering. It involved coordinating the movement of hundreds of ships across thousands of miles of ocean, timing the arrival of convoy echelons to the minute. The technological disparities were stark. The American fleet was now equipped with advanced radar, the CIC, Combat Information Center, which allowed for real-time tracking of enemy air and surface contacts, and the VT fuse, proximity fuse, for anti-aircraft shells. These technological edges would be tested to their limit. However, the decision to go to the Philippines also had a dark side, a cost in human blood that the Formosa proponents had warned about. By committing to a land campaign in the Philippines, the US forces engaged the Japanese army in a massive ground war. The Battle for Manila, fought in early 1945, became the Stalingrad of the Pacific. 100,000 Filipino civilians were massacred by cornered Japanese troops. The city, once known as the Pearl of the Orient, was reduced to rubble. MacArthur had returned, as promised, but the liberation destroyed the very thing he sought to save. Furthermore, the strategic validity of the decision remains a subject of intense debate among military historians. Did the Philippines campaign actually shorten the war, or did it divert resources that could have been used to strangle Japan sooner? The B-29 bases that were eventually established in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, proved sufficient to burn out Japanese cities, rendering the Formosa bases less critical than the Navy had thought. But the Philippines campaign tied up hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who might otherwise have been moved to defend the home islands. From a technical standpoint, the campaign revealed the limitations of American logistics in tropical terrain. The engineers faced mud that could swallow bulldozers whole. They built airfields using Marston mats, perforated steel planks that could be laid down over soft ground to create a runway. Millions of these planks were manufactured and shipped, a feat of industrial production as impressive as the building of the ships themselves. The medical corps battled malaria and dysentery with new synthetic drugs like atabrine, turning the soldiers' skin yellow but keeping them on their feet. The meeting on the Baltimore also marked a turning point in the relationship between the civilian government and the military high command. It demonstrated that in the American system, political considerations, the need for a narrative, a hero, a moral victory can override pure military efficiency. Roosevelt, the master politician, understood that winning the war required more than just capturing coordinates on a map. It required maintaining the psychological momentum of the nation. MacArthur, the flawed vessel of that momentum, was necessary. As the conference concluded and MacArthur prepared to leave, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to a strange, uneasy partnership. The general returned to the Baltimore to say his farewells. This time the mood was lighter, though the underlying tension remained. Roosevelt, ever the charmer, invited MacArthur to stay for dinner. MacArthur, having won his prize, could afford to be gracious, but he declined, citing the need to return to his command. The image of that departure is as striking as the arrival. MacArthur, still in his leather jacket, descending the gangway, having dictated terms to the President of the United States. He had refused to salute, both physically and metaphorically, and he had gotten away with it. The legacy of that day in Pearl Harbor extended well beyond World War II. It set a precedent for the conflict between MacArthur and the presidency that would ultimately destroy him. 7 years later, during the Korean War, MacArthur would try the same power play on another president, Harry Truman. He would again confuse his own military judgment with national policy. He would again treat the commander-in-chief as an equal or an inferior. But Harry Truman was not Franklin Roosevelt. Truman did not have Roosevelt's need for MacArthur's political capital, nor his patience for the general's theatrics. When MacArthur challenged Truman, Truman fired him. In a sense, the pink slip MacArthur received in 1951 was drafted on the deck of the USS Baltimore in 1944. Roosevelt had let the insubordination slide for the sake of victory. Truman punished it for the sake of the Republic. As we look back on July 26, 1944, the technical and human dimensions merge. We see the mighty steel hull of the Baltimore, a product of American industrial genius. We see the map of the Pacific, a grid of tyranny and distance. We see the B-29 seconds waiting on the drawing boards and the LSTs struggling in the surf. But mostly, we see two men, one in a wheelchair, hiding his pain behind a cigarette holder, the other in a leather jacket, hiding his insecurity behind a facade of arrogance. Between them, in the humid air of Pearl Harbor, they decided the fate of millions. The refusal to salute was not just a breach of etiquette. It was a signal that the war had become bigger than the rules that governed it. It was a moment where the cult of personality collided with the chain of command, and in the end, the result was a compromise forged in steel and blood. MacArthur got his return to the Philippines. Roosevelt got his election victory, and the Japanese Empire, caught between the hammer of the Navy and the anvil of the Army, was crushed by a force that, despite its internal divisions, possessed a terrible and unstoppable momentum. The story of the Hawaii Conference is a reminder that history is not an inevitable tide. It is shaped by human choices, by egos, by grudges, and by moments of calculated theatre. The leather jacket, the open collar, the handshake, these were not accidents. They were the costumes and props of a power play that altered the map of Asia. Self-correction. The narration has reached a significant length but needs to be expanded to meet the strict 5,000-word minimum requirement. I will now deepen the technical analysis of the specific machinery mentioned, LSTs, B-29 seconds, the Baltimore, expand on the biographical details of the Bonus Army incident to flesh out the context, and provide a more granular account of the tactical implementation of the later invasion that resulted from this meeting. To fully appreciate the magnitude of the decision made that day, we must descend from the high level of strategy down into the rivet-by-rivet reality of the machinery that made these concepts possible. The landing ship, tank, or LST, which sat at the center of the logistical debate, deserves a closer examination. It was a vessel born of desperation. The British evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940 had proven that without a port, landing heavy equipment was impossible. Churchill had demanded a ship that could bridge the gap between the sea and the shore. The result was the LST, official designation Class II. These ships were 328 feet long, with a 50-foot beam. They were powered by two General Motors 12 to 567 diesel engines, locomotive engines, essentially, adapted for marine use. They produced a mere 900 shaft horsepower each. This meant the LST had a maximum speed of roughly 12 knots, but fully loaded, punching through Pacific swells. They often made less than 9. For the crews, this slowness was agonizing. A convoy of LSTs crossing from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines was a journey of weeks, exposed to submarine attack, sweltering in the tropical heat. The ships were unair-conditioned steel boxes. During the day, the decks became hot enough to blister skin. Inside the tank deck, a cavernous space running the length of the ship, the air was stagnant and smelled of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and rotting vegetation. The genius of the LST lay in its ballast system. To act as a deep ocean transport, it needed a draft of roughly 14 feet. But to land on a beach, it needed to draw less than 4 feet at the bow. The solution was a complex system of pumps and tanks that allowed the crew to take on thousands of tons of seawater to weigh the ship down for the voyage, and then pump it out rapidly as they approached the beach. The flat bottom meant the ship rolled violently in rough seas. The LST roll was infamous. The ship would snap back to vertical with a jarring shudder that threw men from their bunks and nauseated even the most seasoned sailors. When MacArthur argued for the Philippines, he was arguing for a campaign that would consume these vessels by the hundred. The invasion of later alone required a logistical train that defies modern comprehension. It wasn't just about landing men, it was about landing a civilization. An army on the move required bakeries, water purification units, shoe repair depots, field hospitals, and millions of gallons of gasoline. The Red Ball Express of the Pacific was a chain of ships stretching back to San Francisco. Every item, from the 105mm howitzer shell to the syringe of morphine, had to be manufactured, crated, railed to a port, loaded onto a Liberty ship, transported 6,000 miles, transloaded to an LST or landing craft, and hauled onto a hostile beach. The friction between the Navy and the Army at the conference also stemmed from their differing philosophies on how to wield this material power. The Navy, under Nimitz, had perfected the art of the atoll war. This was a war of distinct, violent episodes. The fleet would arrive, pound an island into dust with 16-inch naval rifles, unleash the Marines to storm the beach, secure the island, and then the fleet would move on. It was a pulse-like rhythm. MacArthur's war in New Guinea had been different. It was a continuous grind. It was a war of mud and malaria. His engineers, often African-American units operating under segregated command, performed miracles of construction. They cut roads through jungles that were thought to be impenetrable. They built bridges over rivers that flooded overnight. When MacArthur spoke to Roosevelt of liberation, he was bringing the perspective of a commander whose troops had been living in the jungle for years, not rotating back to clean sheets on a battleship. We must also revisit the Bonus Army incident of 1932 in greater detail to understand the visceral distrust Roosevelt harbored. The image of MacArthur in 1932 was seared into the American consciousness. He had worn his full dress uniform, with all his medals, to disperse a crowd of unemployed, hungry veterans. He had ignored the explicit orders of President Hoover to not cross the Anacostia Bridge into the main encampment. MacArthur crossed it anyway. He claimed the mob was being led by communists, a refrain he would use throughout his career to justify overreach. Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, his aide at the time, had begged him not to go in person, telling him it was no place for the Chief of Staff. MacArthur ignored him. When the tear gas cleared and the fires burned down, 2 babies were dead from gas inhalation and hundreds of veterans were injured. Roosevelt, watching from Albany, saw a man who lacked the essential democratic instinct, the understanding that the military serves the people, not the other way around. This fear was not paranoia. It was grounded in the global context of the 1930s. Mussolini and Hitler were rising in Europe. Franco would soon rise in Spain. The idea of a popular general seizing power was a tangible threat. This background hum of potential treason was the soundtrack to the meeting on the Baltimore. Roosevelt wasn't just managing a general, he was managing a potential rival sovereign. Let us look closer at the B-29 superfortress, the technological ghost at the banquet. The argument for Formosa was entirely predicated on the capabilities of this aircraft. Developed by Boeing, the B-29 was a quantum leap in aviation. Previous bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, were unpressurized. Crews wore heavy shearling flight suits and oxygen masks, fighting frostbite as much as the enemy. The B-29 was pressurized. The crew could sit in shirt sleeves. It had the chaotic innovation of the remote-controlled fire control system. The gunners didn't sit in the turrets. They sat in sighting blisters, using analog computers to aim the guns remotely. This technology, developed by General Electric, corrected for wind speed, gravity, and parallax. It was space-age technology in 1944. However, the B-29 had a fatal flaw in its early deployment. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines. These massive 18-cylinder radial engines were pushed to the absolute limit of their design to lift the heavy bomber. They had a tendency to overheat and catch fire, specifically because the magnesium alloy used in the crankcase was flammable. If an engine fire started, it could burn through the wing spar in seconds, causing the wing to fold and the plane to disintegrate. The decision to base them in the Marianas versus Formosa was a calculation of risk. Formosa would have put them closer to Japan, allowing for heavier bomb loads and less strain on the engines. The Marianas bases meant a 3,000-mile round trip, pushing the engines to the breaking point. When the Navy conceded the argument and the B-29 seconds were sent to the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, the early bombing campaign was indeed a disaster, plagued by engine failures and inaccuracy due to the jet stream, a high-altitude wind phenomenon discovered by these very crews. It was only when General Curtis LeMay changed tactics, stripping the planes of their guns and sending them in at low altitude at night with incendiary bombs, that the B-29 became the city killer it was designed to be. This tactical shift, occurring in 1945, validated the decision to bypass Formosa, though no one knew it at the time on the deck of the Baltimore. The specific geography of the meeting location, the Gatchell Mansion in Waikiki, also added a layer of surrealism. While the men debated the deaths of thousands, the breeze carried the scent of plumeria and ginger. The juxtaposition of paradise and apocalypse was a recurring theme in the Pacific War. The Honolulu Conference was the last time Roosevelt would leave the North American continent. He was failing visibly. His hands shook so badly he could barely sign letters. His pallor was grey. The journey by sea on the Baltimore had been intended as a rest cure. But the stress of the conference consumed him. MacArthur, conversely, was invigorated. He thrived on conflict. His performance at the conference was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He played the role of the humble soldier when necessary, and the grand visionary when it suited him. He knew that Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, and Nimitz were technicians. He was a dramatist. He knew that Roosevelt, a politician to his marrow, responded to narratives. The narrative of the return was simply better than the narrative of the causeway. The invasion of Leyte that resulted from this meeting began on October 20th, 1944. The landing itself was a spectacle designed for the newsreels. MacArthur, ever the showman, had requested a specific landing craft to bring him ashore. When the craft ran aground 50 yards out in knee-deep water, the beachmaster suggested he wait for a dry ramp. MacArthur refused. He ordered the ramp down. He strode into the surf, his khakis soaking wet, his face set in a grim scowl. The photographers captured the moment. It became one of the most iconic images of the war. "People of the Philippines," he broadcast into a microphone set up on the beach. "I have returned." But the camera did not capture the chaos just offshore. The Japanese Navy had launched a desperate counterattack. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf was a chaotic melee. The Japanese lured Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from the landing beaches with a decoy force of empty aircraft carriers. Halsey took the bait, rushing north and leaving the landing transports unprotected. A powerful Japanese surface fleet of battleships and cruisers slipped through the San Bernardino Strait and fell upon the Taffy task units, small escort carriers and destroyers guarding the landing force. What ensued was the Battle off Samar, a fight that should have been a massacre of the Americans but turned into a miracle. Tiny American destroyers, like the USS Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans, charged directly at the massive Japanese battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. They fired their torpedoes and guns, zigzagging through geysers of water. American pilots from the escort carriers flew sorties until they ran out of ammunition, then made dry runs to distract the Japanese gunners. The ferocity of the defense convinced the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, that he was facing the main American fleet. He turned around and withdrew. The invasion force was saved by the skin of its teeth. This near disaster highlights the risks of the strategy MacArthur had pushed for. If the Japanese fleet had broken through, they would have annihilated the LSTs and transports on the beachhead. The troops ashore, including MacArthur, would have been cut off and potentially captured. The Hawaii power play would have turned into the Leyte catastrophe. Roosevelt's gamble on MacArthur was inches away from total ruin. The subsequent campaign on Luzon was grueling. The Japanese commander, General Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, knew he could not stop the American landing. Instead, he withdrew his forces into the mountains and jungles, forcing the Americans to dig them out cave by cave. The fighting went on until the very end of the war. In the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre Mountains and the Balit Pass, American infantrymen fought a war that resembled the trenches of World War I, but with tropical diseases and fanatical enemies. The 32nd Infantry Division, the Red Arrow, spent 654 days in combat during the war, more than any other U.S. division, much of it in this campaign. And then there was Manila. MacArthur had hoped to declare Manila an open city to spare it from destruction, as he had done in 1941. But the Japanese naval troops trapped in the city refused to surrender or withdraw. They embarked on an orgy of violence. The battle for Manila, fought in February and March 1945, remains the only urban battle of the Pacific War comparable to the fighting in Europe. American artillery was forced to level the historic walled city of Intramuros to root out the defenders. The legislative building, the university, the cathedrals, all were reduced to hollow shells. The civilian toll was horrific. When MacArthur walked through the ruins of his former home in the Manila Hotel, stepping over the debris of the penthouse where he had lived before the war, the tragedy was complete. He had returned, but the world he had known was gone. The Pearl of the Orient was a graveyard. This was the grim accounting of the decision made on the sunny deck of the Baltimore. In the years that followed, the tension between the political and the military that was so palpable in Pearl Harbor would become a defining feature of the American century. The National Security Act of 1947, which created the Department of Defense and the CIA, was in part a reaction to the disjointed command structures of World War II. The rivalry between the Army and Navy was institutionalized and managed, but never fully erased. As we reflect on the narrative of July 26, 1944, we must also acknowledge the changing nature of the presidency itself. Roosevelt was the last president to command a war of this scale with such personal, hands-on control. He did not rely on a national security advisor. He relied on his own instincts and the counsel of a small circle of men. His ability to balance the egos of MacArthur, Nimitz, King, and Churchill, while dying of congestive heart failure, is a feat of political endurance that is almost superhuman. The leather jacket that MacArthur wore that day is now a museum piece, a relic of a time when generals could act like movie stars. But the lesson remains. In the high stakes of global conflict, personality matters. The way a man walks, the clothes he wears, the way he shakes a hand, these are data points in the calculation of power. MacArthur refused to salute because he believed himself to be the embodiment of the national will, separate from and equal to the elected government. It was a dangerous delusion, but for a brief window in 1944, it was a delusion that drove the war effort. The USS Baltimore was decommissioned after the war and eventually scrapped. The Gatchell Mansion is gone. The men are dust. But the trajectory they set, the American commitment to Asia, the complex web of alliances, the projection of power across the Pacific, remains the geopolitical reality of our time. The handshake on the deck was the seal on the American empire in the Pacific, a pact that bound the United States to the destiny of Asia for the next 80 years. In the final analysis, the Hawaii power play was not just about MacArthur versus Roosevelt. It was about the nature of democratic warfare. It asked the question, does a democracy fight for strategic interests or for moral imperatives? Does it fight for the most efficient victory or the most just one? The answer, hammered out in that collision of egos, was that it must try to do both, and in the attempt, it will often suffer the tragic consequences of compromise. MacArthur's refusal to salute was the physical manifestation of that tension, the soldier standing apart from the state, demanding that his war be fought his way, while the statesman in the wheelchair, holding the ultimate trump card of legitimacy, smiled, shook his hand, and bent the war to his own political survival.